Okay, let's get started. We're in part two of personality theories and assessment, and we pick up the PowerPoint with Alfred Adler. So let's see, slide says Alfred Adler striving for superiority. So just look at the bullets and then a little bit of explanation about this. Adler actually and Freud, I think we left off with Carl Jung maybe last time, but Freud being the kind of the father of psychoanalytic theory. He and Adler were fairly closely knit on getting that particular methodology, that particular theory off the ground, up and running. So what does it say here? Striving for superiority. The main motivation to overcome the sense of inferiority that felt one would that felt as infants given their totally helpless and dependent state. Sort of mooring that into infant development, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I've got to wake up here. A healthy person learns to cope with these feelings, becomes competent, develops a sense of self-esteem. Inferiority complex involves strong feeling of inferiority felt by those who never overcome this initial feeling of inferiority. So here's the thing. Adler and Freud initially working together to develop psychoanalytic theory, but he rejected, that is, Adler rejected the idea that sex was a major factor in influencing behavior. That was a big deal with Freud, as we sort of skimmed past some of the more graphic details associated with that. A second thing, he believed one's personality developed from the person's need for self-assertion. So this is kind of the opposite of a sense of inferiority. But he says, you really need to work on that self-assertion, or this is what people want, or this is what people need. He also didn't divide human personality into three parts. You remember from Freud, it was the id, and the superego, and then the ego, in the middle. But these three components to personality. So he didn't do that. He said, well, you should really deal with the entire person, or sort of like as a unit, as it were. Next is Karen Horney, is how that's pronounced. Believe it or not, I'm not just inflecting it that way. That's actually how it's pronounced. Karen Horney and the need for security. So this focuses on dealing with our need for security, as the slide says, rather than a sense of inferiority. Horney's dates would be 1885 to 1952. So I like to throw dates out there when I mention someone, because it gives you a sense of the period in which they lived. And that's important, because then you get a sense of how far past Freud or Jung and so on, or Rogers, as we'll come to see in a little bit. And you get some idea of who were the contemporaries. Is she one of the neo-Freudian psychologists, which is to say those that came along after Freud and adapted some of his basic model, but then disagreed with him on some points. Second thing on the slide, child's caregivers must provide a sense of security for a healthy personality to develop. So we're talking about personality theories, assessment, that type of thing. So without security, she's saying a feeling of helplessness and insecurity develops in a hostile world. 3 neurotic personality patterns, neurotic. And she would describe those as in terms of movement. You're moving toward people, moving against people, moving away from people. So where do I want to go with this? So Horney believed people could be their own therapists, which is a whole school of thought called self-therapy. She, in fact, is noted for the kind of this quote, and I won't get it exactly, but it's the essence that life itself is a therapist. Often I have said to people, who disagree on a fundamental truism, about life in this world or about reality. And this is fine. You can feel free to disagree, but life is really its own instructor, isn't it? I mean, there's just certain things that God has embedded in either human nature or the laws of nature or the world around us that are just inflexible, and that's just the way it is. That's reality, right? So life can be its own therapeutic setting, if you will, according to Horney. What else could we say? Maybe touch on that funny little word at the bottom, neurotic, because it's so fun to say. Really, a neurosis, you've heard of that, neurosis, neurotic behavior, a tendency towards anxiety or depression, self-doubt, all those types of things. So I think, as we'll see in some of the personality models, that neurotic is in there, and it's to what degree you have some type of neurosis. Yeah, it's a fun word, isn't it? So do you ever tend towards anxiety? Do you know someone who defaults, towards pessimism and worry and fear and anxiety? Now, it's one thing to have anxious moments, but it's one thing to just be an anxious person all the time. Or someone who is prone to depression and prone to all types of self-doubt. So I suppose in the realm of psychology, when you talk about neuroses or neurotic behavior, it's usually in a spectrum. So remember, before we've had this polarity, and a straight line in between, or what we're making is a continuum. So yeah, it's virtually the same, a spectrum, just like a spectrum of colors. But this would be a spectrum of neuroses, or I should say of neurotic behavior containing a whole bunch of neuroses. But let's just pick one, let's just say anxiety. So anxiety is something that either could be acute and strong and totally envelop your whole being. You're fundamentally a worrier. Whatever's going on, you're worried, and it's this irrational type of worry. But you could say, well, there's a rational worry. There's things, sure, and you could say that virtually about everything. If you have money and good health, oh my word, I could lose my money. I could lose my health. If you're in a relationship, though, I could lose my relationship. You could lose anything. Okay, but do you obsess about that? So some people are just obsessive worriers. Some people will sort of transmute the terms. I never worry about anything, but I do have some concerns. I'm not sure how valid that is. But you get the idea about, neuroses and neurotic things. So Horney, it just sounds sophisticated too to say her name that way, right? But it is how you pronounce it. Horney is what we call a neo-Freudian. So she agreed with Freud basically about the tenets of his psychoanalytic theory. And what would that be? The id, the ego, the superego, those basic tenets. But she modified his theory according to her own opinions and things. You'll find that of many of the post-Freudian era psychologists, he being the father, the progenitor of psychology really as a science, not just psychology as an asylum, keep the patient warm and so on and so forth, but let's try to understand behavior. Let's try to modify behavior and so on, and all those types of sophisticated theories and assumptions, mostly, right? Mostly assumptions, not proven theories in the sense of empirical testing, but a lot of assumptions. In the case of Horney, uh, she felt that Freud focused far too heavily on the sexual component, on childhood experiences, and then she chose to focus more on the positive aspects of human nature, especially where it comes to social relationships and the influence of society on human behavior. So let's talk a little bit about humanism and the humanistic approach. And if you recall, I believe it was this course and earlier on in this course, we talked a little bit about enlightenment, post-enlightenment. Well, I guess we were talking about pre-modern, modern, postmodern, and then even going postmodern. And we threw this all up on the whiteboard and really had a time with it. I think it was a pretty good time that we had. Loaded that whiteboard all up and drew lines and circles everywhere and lots of different colors. So humanism is basically a movement that came out of the Enlightenment, which is basically the late 18th century European kind of rational movement that sort of jettisoned the medieval theological assumptions of the church, of the role of God in the world. And what I mean by that is God being so central to our understanding of the world that all phenomena are explainable by God or by God's working or God's making or God's intervention, God's creation, all those kinds of things. Well, what if you took God out of that? What do you have left? What you have left is sort of a vacuum and a void, but what in fact you have left is a human being. And what about a human being? Not just the physical properties, but the fact of what a human being can do. A human being has the capacity of reflection, observation, reasoning, and reasoning in such a logical fashion as to accumulate all this data and evaluate this data and render certain conclusions. But what happened with humanism is that rather than God being the be-all and end-all, the center point, the default point, the point of reduction of every argument, of every problem, of every resolution, it became man. What can man do? And, so it's the difference between a call to prayer and a call to reflect in the midst of a crisis. The call to prayer, the call to worship, the crying out to God versus what can man do? Let's take an inventory of all that the sciences can give and provide for us as an answer to this. So humanism has sort of the ugly feature of pushing God out altogether and not factoring God in any way. So as Christians, we sort of want to be careful lest we're misunderstood. We can be so anti-humanistic. We're not anti-human. And I think that's maybe the place to make the distinction and to say, look, I'm not anti-human, you tell your friend, maybe your non-believing friend. So let's say a very educated non-believing friend who would know something about humanism, and you say, listen, I'm not anti-human, but I am anti-humanism. Because humanism means we throw all in what human beings can do, and there isn't anything outside of human ability from which to draw or to build our expectation and our hope. Whew, that would be a travesty, right? So let's just look at this slide a little bit, and specifically, it ties in then humanism or the humanistic approach. So if you were a humanist, how would you take a humanistic approach to personality? And so here you have a couple of things. You have the social cognitive approach to personality, the humanistic approach to personality. Those two things. So on the one side, then you have humanistic theories developed in the 1960s. Yeah, this is really, I would say, through the course of my lifetime, which started in September of 1960. So I sort of grew up when many of these kind of postmodern, after the modern era, where there was an acute amount of scientific evaluation, but objectivity. And truth was still thought of in absolute terms, not the relative terms that people understand it today. And you say, well, where did all this ethical relativism, social relativism, cultural relativism, where did epistemological relativism, where did all this begin? Well, I won't say precisely begin, maybe a point of origin, but when did it begin to develop? And you'd have to go back to the 60s. And here you have part of a response of deterministic psychoanalytic. We'll talk about that in a second. And strict behavioral psychological approaches. Those are not two different things, but you can put those together. Deterministic psychoanalytic and strict behavioral psychological approaches that dominated psychology and the study of personality. Humanistic theories then emphasize conscious free will in one's actions as opposed to determinism. Like determinism, certainly not free will, because it's all predetermined in this sense. And even among Christian theologians, you have a vast amount of disagreement between those that would be on the side of Jacobus Arminius, or what we call Arminians, and where you'd certainly have a lot of autonomy, a lot of free will, and on the other side, John Calvin and those more proponents of Reformed theology, and that there is no free will, and can even go to the extremes of determinism. So we're kind of used to those terms, but we'll have to see just how they relate to psychoanalytic theories and so forth in just a second. Then the social cognitive theories developed in the 60s. Wasn't that a wonderful era? Just go back and Google the 60s, or you probably something on Netflix or Prime TV or one of those, whatever it is. They generally do the decades, the 60s, the 70s, 80s. Just take a peek at the 60s. And so I grew up in that. We lost our president, was assassinated. His brother was later assassinated. Martin Luther King, great civil rights leader, was assassinated. Malcolm X. And so we had shootings on campuses. And I understand, to your palate today, given how many, they were just saying with the COVID-19 lockdown, that for the first time in I don't know how many consecutive days, there has not been a single shooting on a college campus or a school or something. I mean, it's tragic, isn't it, that we have to think in terms like this today, that it's relative to whether there was a shooting. Hey, it's a good day there wasn't a shooting at a school today. Wow. And this is only just really since Columbine and those days and such, right? But the 60s were, we were in the midst at that point of the Vietnam War, and on the evening broadcast, you'd see the latest toll, just like now. All this stuff brings back memories. Well, these are how many died today from the virus, but back then it was, this is how many troops. We keep an aggregate total of the amount of troops that were lost, American troops lost in battle, and so on, to keep this in front of the people all the time. And so there was a lot of protests about end the war and all these kinds of things. The 60s, a very tumultuous time. So let's just take make a couple of side notes here. We talk about humanistic approaches, free will, things of this nature. So the psychoanalytical psychologists or theorists, the Freudian or the neo-Freudian, believe that human nature or behavior is deterministic. That is, it's governed by irrational forms, and the unconscious as well as instinctual and biological drives governed by these kind of irrational forms. So to simplify that a little bit, if you remember with the id that we were saying, using terms like, well, it's just this kind of innate and native urge or desire, some aspect that needs to have a leash put on it. It needs to be governed. It needs to be controlled, something like that. And so in a sense, this is where they're going with the lack of free will and determinism. They're saying there are just certain things there that the individual person does not have access to. And so if you don't have access to something, you can't control it. If you can't control it, then where is the freedom of it? That is basically it's determined. It's very deterministic, certain elements of this that can't change. So no free will, nothing happens by chance on a Freudian perspective. So an example would be, have you ever misspoke and then wonder, why did I misspeak but that particular word? And sometimes it's kind of funny, but sometimes they're called Freudian slips, where something just sort of pops out of your mouth that popped into your head. And so that's the idea of the determinism, that it's saying that, see, there are things that you can't control. You think you can control them, but you can't control them. And there it is. And, it's sort of popped out unbeknownst to yourself. It's a crude example, but it's an example. So you have Abraham Maslow here on the right-hand side. And we're still talking about humanism, but here's the humanistic approach to personality. Allah, that is to say, to get real fancy, Allah, according to Abraham Maslow and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we're not going to spend a lot of time with this, but it's a pyramid, and we'll look at it in just a moment. It is somewhat informative, or I should say it informs, without directly saying it. It does, or using that model, it does inform a lot of textbooks and basic understanding of human behavior and such. So, humanism, as we mentioned, this Enlightenment move away from comprehending the world and people according to a divine center, right? But Maslow, being an American psychologist, 1908, we said that there's enough German psychologists, but here's American, and many of these that we'll look at today are American psychologists, but his date's 1908 to 1970, so now well past some of the others that we've mentioned. Maslow considered the father of the humanistic movement, studied the lives of healthy and creative people to develop his theory of personality, which is the legacy is basically this hierarchical arrangement of human behavior that we'll see here. So here's the hierarchy of needs according to Maslow, and needs are organized hierarchically into levels, as you see them from the bottom to the top in a pyramid style. So the more pressing basic needs are at the bottom of the pyramid. The level at which a person is investing most of his or her effort is the most important one at that particular point in time. So hierarchy includes first four needs that are deficiency based. That is to say, what you don't have, but you need. And then a fifth at the top, self-actualization, is growth-based. So deficiency-based, growth-based. So just to put a pin in this for just a second, and to look at this a little bit. Now, in other words, you have all these needs, right? And you say, well, what's most important? Well, that's going to depend. Think right now, And I suppose these videos will all be dated by the COVID-19 lockdown, if you will, or self-quarantine. So what's most important to people now, I ask? If you were to apply Maslow's hierarchy to, if you're at home with your parents and maybe your parents have been laid off and maybe someone's lost a job, maybe this is a crazy stressful time for some folks. If they're not worried about the health concerns somewhat, they might be deeply concerned about if there's going to be a job to go back to and just how things are going to change and so on and so forth. So what do you think? I mean, looking at this, do you think they're concerned about their physiological needs? I think probably early on, and depending, I mean, if you're living in New York City and you've got to jump one of those subways every day and you've seen the pictures on there with everybody just about almost mouth to mouth, and I've been on plenty of those subways, you're packed in like sardines. So those people might be thinking, wow, am I going to contract this? Am I going to be one of the death toll? How is this going to work? I have to go to work. I have to this, people is it physiological? And then as things, begin to tamp down somewhat and people become more accustomed to the new routine or the new norm, is it safety needs? Is it belongingness and love needs? Is that what's good? And you say, well, probably not, except that you're outside your social community now. You're going to church online and you're getting it. It's just like, it's great. Hey, preacher, thanks. And to the music team or whomever, but you're missing the contact, and, you're missing the sense of belongingness that you realize now that social media and the digital delivery of a relationship it's as cold as that, device that you're holding on to. So maybe it's that, or, and then you'd say, well, the esteem, I don't know, or the self, not really worried about self-actual, worried about just getting back to normal and things like that. But that's kind of how it works, whatever's most important. Now, if you were to take this into like evangelism, where I've seen this used back in the day, it was like, how does Maslow relate to evangelism? Well, I ask you, if you go to a rescue mission or a homeless person or somebody, just any range of these types of presenting problems that people have, what's their ability to listen to the gospel if they're focused on their physiological need? For example, let's say you go somewhere and you say, listen, you listen to me, if you listen to my sermon, I'm going to preach the gospel to you. And in exchange for you listening to me, now you either say that directly or indirectly. If you say it directly, then that's exactly what you say. In exchange for you listening to me, then we have this meal prepared for you. We'll feed you after. But first you got to listen. Or you do it indirectly, and you just schedule the meal after. And while the person's sitting there and they're hungry, maybe they only get one meal a day and they're hungry. Maybe they haven't eaten for a couple of days and they're just smelling this food cooking and people preparing it and all of this. And are they going to be thinking about self-actualization at the top? Are they going to be thinking about, their spiritual needs? Are they going to be thinking about something abstract like that when something physical and material is impacting their body? They're going to be totally distracted, or they're going to respond for the wrong reason, something of that nature. So that's Maslow. And just because a psychologist came across a concept and put it on a pyramid doesn't mean it's necessarily original with them. For example, whatever truth, kernels of truth you find in any of these observations that we talk about in this class, let's not just credit psychology with, wow, that was brilliant, when you can open up your Bible and go, boom, there it is right there. Hey, have you seen it here? It's right there. So psychology as a science doesn't have a corner on the truth if it contains how much of a degree of it. A stopped watch, they say, is correct twice a day anyway. But we'll give a little bit more credit here to the science of observational science of looking at human nature. But I'm just saying, if Maslow comes across something, we can see it certainly by example or by precept in Scripture. What else? A characteristic of the self-actualized person, right? That was the top of the ladder, so to speak, at the top of the pyramid. Accepting themselves and others and the nature of the world for what they are. Now, this would be like if you're going to attain this sort of supreme and mature and well-adjusted kind of person in the world, having a need for privacy and only a few close emotional relationships. In other words, you're not one of these needy people that everybody has to like me, everybody has to be my friend. You're a lot more discerning than that, being autonomous and independent. You're not codependent with someone else, or you're not relying on somebody else's opinion to get you through or to give you some little bit of self-worth. Having peak experiences, which are experiences of deep insight in which they experience whatever they are doing as fully possible. Just meaning you experience satisfaction, with what's in front of you, instead of just always, craving the next thing and the next thing, and you have this insatiable appetite that can never be satisfied. So self-actualization has to do with potentialities, coming to your this highest level of psychological development and something of that nature. So an evaluation by the writer of your textbook Maslow criticized for being, as many of these psychologists, non-empirical and vague. Which is to say, you have an opinion. So, all of these have some general opinion, some generally expressed opinion, but it's subjective, non-empirical. And maybe that's just the nature of psychology. I mean, you can dress it up and try to make it look empirical, and especially, what's the best way to do that? The neurosciences. So you're studying the neurons and the transmitters and the receptors, and you remember all that stuff, right? So if you start there and you sort of peel back a layer and say, well, look at all that anatomical sort of warrant for making our decisions, and it sounds all scientific. But if you conflate that with just observations of human behavior to try to substantiate your observations as having value, simply because you can demonstrate that certain emotions, sensations are based on neurons and the activity and so on, it just doesn't hold. Those two things don't hold. One doesn't necessarily explain the other or ground the other. So we have to be careful that, look up the word conflate, and you'll see people do this all the time. They take something that is verifiable and they pair it with something that is not verifiable. But because they've paired it, they hope you won't see the other side, but you'll hope that they hope that you'll include the non-verifiable in with the verifiable. Theologians can do this too, so you can become a little more astute and clever in theological studies. And it's not the content of your theological studies, but it is your methodology in employing that content to make decisions and conclusions, so on and so on. So methodology is a big deal. Why am I talking about that? I do not know. Rogers, not Mr. Rogers, but I guess, yeah, Mr. Rogers. This guy would be Dr. Rogers. He kind of looks like he's friendly, like Mr. Rogers. And what he's got draped over him, guys, if you go back to the 60s, these were the first lapel mics, these heavy things that they just throw around your neck or clip it somehow into your pocket there or something. So a little bit of old technology to go with the black and white. So he was what's called a client-centered therapist, dealt with young, bright college students with adjustment problems. Do you know any of those? Emphasized self-actualization, like Maslow believed that people have strong need for positive regard. Positive regard is to be accepted by, to have affection of others, especially the significant others in our life. There's things like genuineness that you look for. I want people to be genuine. I want to be accepted, and empathy then becomes something strong. Just to continue, this should say, but Rogers' self-theory, part 2, contingent conditions of worth, unconditional positive regard. So conditions of worth that develop as parents set up behaviors and attitudes for which they would give us positive regard, which on Rogers, this is what we're looking for. Should we say positive reinforcement? I mean, do we like that? Do we want somebody to give us some type of a measurement when we're doing well, we're exceeding what's expected? We don't want to hear that we're coming up short. But sometimes we do, so that we can, okay, I get it. I'm coming up short. What do I have to do to get here? What do I have to do to exceed that? I just don't want to be average. I think my brother-in-law some years ago had a bumper sticker on his car that said, like, to be average is average. The definition of average is you're as close to the bottom as you are to the top. And he says, I don't want to be that way. I want to be just, better than that. But this is the idea. And he's saying this if you're dealing with the children and early life or early childhood, that is to say, is there that positive reinforcement to know when you're doing well, when you're doing the right thing? Gives the child the ability to have a good self-concept, according to Rogers. Then unconditional positive regard. So he's talking about, basically conditional positive regard and unconditional positive regard, as we'll see in the next slide. So acceptance and approval without condition is the unconditional positive regard. Acceptance and approval without condition, and that's necessary for that I don't need that anymore. I can arrive at a self-concept that I'm accepted and approved without all the other stuff. So Rogers' theory here, basically outlined in this chart. We have conditions of worth, conditional positive regard, and then up above, like if you're tracing the arrows, there are conditions of worth. There's the conditional positive regard, the positive reinforcement. And then if you jump up to self-concept is congruent with the true self. What in the world does that mean? And then over to self-actualization. So we're saying self-actualization is where we want to be, according to Rogers, fully developed. We don't have all this neurotic behavior and all this stuff, but we feel quite comfortable in our own skin. So you start with these conditions of worth, whatever they are. What are those things that make up a basic conditions of worth? And perhaps that is the true self. And what we mean by true self is, the idealized self. Yeah, this can be a little difficult to grasp, but not too difficult. But everyone has sort of like this idealized self, in the sense of this is the expectation that I have of who I should be. And when that self-concept is congruent with the true self, in other words, the self-concept being who I perceive myself to be. So this is how I see my life. This is my, I mean, for real, this is who I am for real, with warts and all the problems, all the issues, but this is who I am. And if that is congruent with the true self, then according to Rogers, well, fine. Job done. Way to go. You're this self-actualized person. Now, don't equate this with some sort of Buddhist or Hindu, resolution of all the karmic issues, and you've achieved enlightenment. That's not what he's talking about here. But it just means a certain sense of psychological maturity. You've hit the mark. That's where you want to be. That's how you want to live in that self-actualized state, according to Rogers. But what happens if that self-concept is not congruent with the true self? What happens if there's this sense of, oh, this is who I should be, but this is who I am? Then self-actualization is deterred. We could say deferred as well. It needs unconditional positive regard to develop the true self. In other words, the conditional positive regard hasn't worked. And so you need this unconditional regard, unconditional positive regard to develop the true self. So you'll live within this conflict. Now, of course, this is not nobody consulted the Bible on this. I'm sure Carl Rogers didn't consult the Bible on this. We understand the inner tensions of our flesh, which the Apostle Paul, just look at the Apostle Paul. He draws what's called a flesh-spirit dichotomy, which means there are these two these two basic categories that describe human nature. You have the immaterial and the material. Now, I understand, and you do as well, if you've studied your theology textbook, that you have the tripartite model, body, soul, and spirit, something like that. But you can still have the three, but have the three in two categories. And I think you'd agree. I hope you'd agree. There's a material and an immaterial, whatever you want. If you want to put soul and spirit, or soul hyphen spirit, and then flesh over here, then you have this model. But, we know that that this is human nature. You add to that the Spirit of God that comes in. And if we're understanding spiritual formation, which we really can't talk about, in this course too much, we realize that the Spirit of God then makes that inner appeal. It is that person that is always beckoning to God's standard and God's best, but making that appeal to the flesh, making that appeal to the soul and the spirit. And you have to say, well, how does that work? Well, I think you have what are called the higher affections, if I can get all spiritual formation on you, the higher affections and the lower affections. And it doesn't mean because they're lower affections that they're bad, or the higher affections that they're better or something. But by higher means those things that are toward God, and the lower, those things which are toward the world. And so you'd say, well, God is better than world, so it should be higher and lower. But by world, we mean life in this world. So our flesh interacts with life in this world. And it is the Spirit of God that will influence how we utilize these bodies in a proper way to live in this world, right? But then there's also the higher affections, we could say, the higher affections, which would be those impulses that direct us towards God. And it's the Spirit of God through prayer, through study of the Word, and through what is not physical, but what is the immaterial side, and that is our communion with God, our enjoyment of Him. Not just prayer, but in a very affective way. It affects our emotions, our well-being, and all those things. So I don't know where that fits into Rogers' model, except that there is a tension. There can be what's called an incongruency between what God wants me to be and that what I find myself to be. Just peruse Romans chapter 7, and where Paul was saying, I want this, but I'm that, and I don't want to do that, but I find myself doing this, and oh, wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body, the sarx, the body of this death? And he says, well, I thank God through Jesus Christ. Okay, so we know as Christians that personality theories, assessments, models, and things like that take a different shape, but this course helps us understand how others that don't know Jesus, how others that are not part of our great Christian community, what do they have available to them? They go for counseling and they're hearing these types of theories, which are not on their face, 100% wrong, but there's no life in them. They're like an empty shell. And it's like, well, this is the best that we have. And in fact, that's basically what they're saying. They're saying we're humanists. And so this is the best that humans can do to help other humans that are struggling. But at the end of the day, it's empty. It's empty and void. You can describe the problem, but you really can't cure it. That's also a lot of philosophy right there. You can ask all the right questions, but you just don't have any answers for it. So let's move on to what? The social cognitive approach to personality. And this was the flip side of when we started down this path with Rogers. Research-based by combining elements of three major research perspectives: the cognitive, hopefully we have a grasp of what that is now, the whole thought life, the behavioral, and what we do, the sociocultural, how what is outside of us, society, cultural, works to develop our perception and thinking, right? How about Bandura? Bandura, Albert Bandura, is born 1925, still living, I believe. So he's up there, 95. His self system, this set of cognitive processes by which a person observes, evaluates, and regulates his or her social behavior, includes a conscious decision to choose what behavior to engage in based on assessment of reinforcement value, right? So you can read that. I just read it. What is that self kind of system? So this would involve, according to Bandura, or we'd say on Bandura, this is how he would say it. We have self-observation, that would be one. Judgment would be two, and then self-response, that would be three. So self-observation, we regulate our behavior by monitoring our performance and adjusting accordingly. Notice that this is the self thing. I'm going to watch what I do, and I'm going to modify that and monitor it. I don't know to what standard Bandura is talking about. But a second thing, judgment, we make a subjective evaluation of the consequences of our behavior, right? So we do something and we contemplate it and we say, no, I don't think that was the right thing to do. So that's a subjective, negative kind of subjective approach to that, the judgment, or we discern that it was the right thing to do. A self-response then, we provide self-reinforcement or self-punishment. In other words, we either encourage ourselves to continue on that path, or we discourage ourselves in some way. And all this is depending on really our own self-imposed standards, or something like that of behavior. But then there's what he calls self-efficacy, or judgment of one's effectiveness in dealing with particular situation. Plays a major role in determining our behavior. So this is either low self-efficacy or high self-efficacy. So self-efficacy, you're talking about belief in one's ability to succeed, efficacious, effective, efficacy. Can you do it? Can you achieve it? So self-efficacy, then, belief in one's ability to succeed. Low self-efficacy is associated with depression, with anxiety, with helplessness. High self-efficacy is associated with self-confidence, positive outlook, and minimal self-doubt. And so that follows, and it makes sense pretty well. Let's do one more, and I think we're going to hit this in three parts instead of two, just so we don't do these crazy long videos. Crazy long, not crazy long videos, but crazy long. So this is Julian Rotter, Julian Rotter, or Rotter's locus of control. This is an interesting little thing to finish with. But so he originated this idea of, let me just use this word sex again, because that'll wake you up. But if I use this term again and associate that with Freud, right? So Freud's whole thing was about, sex, and most of these psychologists then would all revolve around something. There's some center point, and whether it's self-esteem, self-worth, something. Well, here, Rotter, the locus is the center of something. A locus, loci would be more than one center in your model. That sounds weird, but it's a thing. His locus is control. That's control. Everything sort of reduces down to control in some sense. So a person's perception of the extent to which he or she controls what happens to him or to her. So there's an external locus of control. There's an internal locus of control. The external locus of control refers to the perception that chance or external, what's going on outside of me. If I take a passive position, then it's whatever's going on outside of me is controlling what I'm doing. This is, I can sort of blame it off on, push it off, blame it on, if my preposition's right, stuff outside of me. What's happening here is because of all that out there. But the internal locus of control refers to the perception that you control. It doesn't matter, whatever's out there. I am the captain of my soul. I'm the guardian. Something of that effect. So people with an internal focus, to take that one first, they perceive success as dependent on their own needs, or they may or may not feel that they have competence to bring about a successful outcome. So I don't think I have what it takes, something like that. That's an internal focus. The external may develop learned helplessness or hopelessness, especially if you feel that those external elements are stable. Now, what I mean by stable is in this sense, not stable in a good way, but stable in that they can't change. They can't change it. So if one perceives that either internally, externally, that's incapable of change, I can't move that mountain, then you're going to learn this sense of helplessness and hopelessness. And the more that you learn it, the more that is your default response to a situation, that you feel this is too much for me. No, instead of saying I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, or God's put me in this situation, he's going to provide, and I'll tell you, that's really where you want to be. You want to be careful when these two clowns approach you in life. One's helplessness. He's this pitiful thing, and he just wants to wrap his arms around you and tell you just what a wonderful person you are. And if you wouldn't mind, if he can come live with you, really, can I just come hang out with you? You're such a wonderful guy. Can I come out hang with you? And the other one's hopelessness. I don't know which ones. They're both pretty friendly. They're both pretty affable and whatever, but they're the two kind of guys that just hang on your shoulders and drag you down every single day. And once you let them in the door, they're not going anywhere. I mean, they say they're just coming for the night, but they're going nowhere. They're going to hang out with you forever, and you're just gonna you're just going to lay off all blame for your lack of ability to do anything. It's, well, just these two guys, you know, it's these, what else can I do? It sounds silly, but maybe it is. But I think there's some truth to it. So here's, just finish here. So I found this little graphic of Rotter, internal locus of control, external locus of control. So let's just start in the middle. The active person with the star on the inside, the passive person with the star on the outside, because a passive person is a type of person. I can't do anything. No, it's just. It's all this stuff is just happening to me, and I can't do anything. It's just I can't. The reason why I could be so fluent on this is because I remember as a young man. Of course, I've known Sally forever, right? I mean, just forever. But so she can tell you all about Doug as a teenager, And it was this. She had to beat it out of me. I want to say she didn't. That's a metaphor, but I'm not sure it always was. She is going to convince me that you do not say, I can't. You just don't say it. And to this day, I cannot. I can come here and say it, but I'm not going to say that with her present. She doesn't tolerate it. And she doesn't live that way. And she's not going to tolerate an I can't passive. She will not give helplessness and hopelessness aid or comfort. She doesn't care how pitiful they look. They're not coming in, and they're not going to. And what I mean is this: she's not going to allow those two clowns to invade her mental outlook with things like I'm helpless and hopeless. No child of God is ever helpless or hopeless. We know that. So even though these things are all psychological and we're talking about some crazy humanists and stuff, but we still have to understand truth is truth, right? Wherever we find it, we don't want to commit the genetic fallacy. Remind me to tell you about that sometime. So active or passive, what's the locus of control? And look at the active guy, and to the same extent, you could err on this side. I determine my future, wow, watch out for that I, right? But you have either I make things happen or things happen to me. Those are two perspectives. And I know what you're thinking because you're all intelligent people. You're going to say, well, wait a minute. So aren't those what you were talking about before? Like here's a polarity, here's a polarity. You're going to get this after a while. Here's a straight line, here's a continuum. So what if we have one locus being one polarity, the other locus being the other polarity? So here's internal, external. Is there not and let's just treat these, let's introduce a new term. Let's treat these as a dialectic model. That is of two things, make them two spheres. And these two spheres, we expand the polarity into two spheres. These two spheres are in dialectical tension. Two things in dialectical tension that will overlap at some point. And when you overlap these two, you're going to have some shaded area that is a closer approximation, not a compromise, but a closer approximation to what is true. And so there's something here, that says, well, neither one of these is good. And it's not exactly an accurate picture of a mature person that they're one or the other. They're more likely an admixture of some elements of both. So, you could have a person on the one hand that says, I'm not going to be overcome by the world around me. I can do all things. And this is the thing, like if the Apostle Paul stopped in 4:13 and said of Philippians, and he said like, I can do all things, exclamation point, right? Just like what's said at the bottom, he would have erred. Because what's in the middle, what's missing is through Christ. Through Christ, I can face my external circumstances. Through Christ, I can overcome my need to dominate and sit on the throne of my life. And so but nonetheless, it's interesting just to see. Of course, Christ is not going to be in this because this is a humanistic approach, right? But we can add certainly a victorious component by adding Jesus to this picture. Okay, let's finish there, and we'll come back with one more shot at personality and assessment.